All right, this video is going to be a little different. We're in honor of Seto winning SE Ultimecia. I sent him a bunch of questions, and he was kind enough to answer them. He sort of gave a summary of each of his matchups. He had 4 matchups on the way to the title, and some thoughts on each. And then I asked a few questions about some of the games. And for the video, I'll be clicking through. You can see some of the games as they happened. So this is round two, game three. I didn't list the game numbers always, but round two, game three against Turdz. And he described his Turdz matchup as I felt a lot of pressure from Turdz in the first 2 games, which is why I changed things up a bit and went with the 7-6-6-2 pair in Ruby Dragon. We can see he has the 6-6-2-7 and the 2-7-6-6. I did end up thinking by the end of this round, and maybe I say that at some point in here, but I did end up thinking this was kind of the optimal hand structure for this round. Seto and Yevon both did really exemplary jobs of showing how powerful 7-6-6s along with a 7-7 horizontal or vertical were on this rule set. All right, back to Seto. Felt like a big risk before the game started, because even though the point was to mix things up, it didn't look like the cards would go well together. Fortunately, it applied heavy pressure to him from the start. Even Turdz said my Ruby Dragon gave him fits, despite not having to play it in the end. Then I asked, in your winning game versus Turdz, when did you know you had won? And he said, in the winning game against Turdz, which is the one you have on screen, I knew I won when he went in 1. My reason for starting in 9 was to muck the game up for him. I could take both cards from both 6 and 8, but he couldn't do it without setting up a separate combo. I figured if he went in 1, to him it would look promising, but ultimately I could leave a 7 facing out in 2 and be safe, relying on my double captures in 6 or 8, or even the threat of Ruby Dragon, which is safety in 4 or 6. When I moved in 9, it worried me that he'd go 3-6-7-6, I think that was it, in 7, as I saw that as one of the few ties he had, with some combo situations I would have to be very careful about not to lose myself. So he was right, and I took a while to realize it, not till a few moves later. But after his move 2-7-6-6 and 2, he is completely winning. I thought Turdz played the best move here, 5-4, 5-7, and 4, I think. Um, but Seto had calculated something I completely missed, and he had seen that from farther back. Now I put in most of the games, but this one, yeah. So he went in 7, which I missed, walking into combos. But the point is that Turd's only ways to capture 5, which is a problem, and then Seto can combo back. And even though Turd's is a capture at the end, it's not enough, and Seto wins. So I'm not going to go into too much depth on the games besides what Seto says about them, because this is about kind of his thoughts, and I've already commentated, and in this case, gotten deeply wrong everything about this game already. So we'll leave it there. And if you want to think more about the games, there's videos about most of these. So I asked, and this was clearly just me doing PR for something one of my numbers things, but it sounds like the first 2 games are when you felt most at risk in the whole 10-game tournament run. Possibly not relevant, but one of my thingies tries to estimate win percentage for players at various points in a game, where 0 equals definite loss for a player, 50 equals even game, 100 equals definite win for a player, 25 is midway between a loss and a tie, 75 is midway between a win and a tie. It's not a great system, but I'm curious if it aligns with your feelings here. There were 2 lone turns, meaning just like not 2 games, but there were 2 moments in the whole tournament where Seto's value fell, where your score dropped below 40. 40 meaning, slight disadvantage. 25 is midway between a tie and a loss. Under 40 is definitely danger, but this is pretty remarkable to have a run where he had only 2 positions that were slightly below 40. But anyways, back to the question. 2 lone turns over the entire 10 games of the tournament where your score dropped below 40. First, here in Game 2 against Turdz. We will look at Game 2 later. This is from Game 3. And later, Game 2 versus Tezuka, with it rating the latter as slightly more dangerous. Seto replies, Game 2 versus Turdz was probably my most uncomfortable. Our hands were very similar, and there were just so many combo opportunities in every spot that you had to be very careful not to get caught, especially against someone as good as Turdz. I didn't feel as pressured in Game 2 against Tezuka as I did against Turdz or even Midas. Like I said earlier, I made it way more complicated than I should have. Um, Because I've moved around the questions, he has in fact said this later in the interview, uh, but he was disappointed with how he played game two against Tezuka. I thought my second move was a tie when I made it, but I looked at too many abstract moves instead of starting with the basics and ruling out the simple moves first. I was a little annoyed about it at the time. So that ends our coverage of the Turdz Seto match, and we will move on to Sergio Seto. The rule set was pretty straightforward, but the first game bothered me because I missed a win I shouldn't have. Turned out to have been a tie anyway, which I bugged you about. We can go to that position. I'm going to ask you a question about this move in six. But in this position, he ended up going in one, but he had intended to and thought after that 1, 7, 8, 9, and 3 was winning, which is again a move I talk about fairly extensively in my video about it. And it's very close to winning. Sergio would have one tie in four, which he might have found because Sergio played really well this tournament, but very close to winning and practically very good winning chances. He ends up going in one, and Sergio holds this game. Probably also didn't help that we played around 5 a.m. my time, stupid decision, so it confused the hell out of me. Glad to have gone second in the next game. I built my hand without a set starter, so it was much easier to work around his move in 5. Also, I just watched your video, sorry, of me versus Sergio. Seeing it with a fresh set of eyes, I think my move in 6, which is this move, 9, 7, 2, 8, and 6, which I asked about because, or was curious about, and in my video was curious about because it seemed to me that 1, 8, 9, 8 was such a good card for 6 and 8 that blocking those squares felt a little strange, unintuitive. And if you were going to block one, it seemed more natural to me to block 8. So I thought Seto's move in 6 was really interesting. And as we see in the game continuation, after if Seto had gone in 3, it's very close to winning. So it's not to say this is a bad move. It's to say it's a move that was very unintuitive to me, and those are the moves I'm kind of most curious about. So he says, I think my move in 6 was for the purpose of sweeping the end with 1, 8, 9, 8 and 7, 6, 7, 5. Looking at it now, it just looks silly that I blocked myself from having another combo as 6. I sure as hell don't remember why I went 1 instead of 3 after he went to 8. That just looks clunky as hell. Can't believe I even went there. So possibly 5 a.m. effect, but did hold, It's not a winning position. There are ties here. And I think it's interesting how much more Seto thinks in terms of sweepers, right? And we can see maybe we can think about 6 this way, where Seto's cards that are most likely to dominate is it's really easy to imagine a situation where 1, 8, 9, 8 just sweeps up top, right? Just has everything. And it's pretty easy to imagine a situation where 7, 6, 7, 5 sweeps the left side of the board. There are a whole bunch of variations where that was coming up. First of all, it already has this key plus wall in 4, but second of all, there are a lot of 8s that could be faced up, and if the 7s face up, if there's an 8 facing left and there's a lot of 8s to face left, then 7, 6, 7, 5 can pick those off too. And so if you're thinking, I want 1, 8, 9, 8 to sweep the top, and I want 7, 6, 7, 5 to sweep the left, then I think you'd be drawn to moves in 6 and 8, right? Those are the moves that leave those squares most accessible. But if you play in 8, your opponent has some choice of where to go. Maybe 4, maybe 6. Well, if you play in 6, they're probably kind of obliged to go 8, and you leave as many of those squares as possible. And I'm not sure that's what Seto was thinking, but I do think he has this really strong feel for which cards will play very well in endgames, and he's very fast at calculating these endgames and how to leave the right squares open for them to do so. And so 9, 7, 2, 8, to my eyes, looks like it's doing the wrong things on board, right? Or not wrong, but like unintuitive things. It looks like it's not interacting with the board in the way I'd think to interact. And for other players, I talked briefly to Vid about this game. He was saying this looked way more intuitive to him because he is also a player who's more looking for how to set up sweepers. And so this setup, and especially this setup a few moves later, with 1, 7, 8, 9, and 3, just looked like a dream to him, where he has just these 2 incredible sweepers. How could this not be good? And to me, this looks like, okay, they have the only secured card. They have a plus in 5. I have no safe cards on board. This looks quite dangerous. And it turns out the kind of the sweeper theory of it is the stronger theory. This is very close to being a win for Seto If we click the dump eval button, you can see there is one tie. And it's not a trivial move to make at all. My question about this game was, did you play at 5 a.m. specifically so I wouldn't be able to record it? And he said, yes, but at least I didn't post a move order of 6969696666, for which I think we can all be grateful. On to the first game of the final, or the first match of the finals against Tezuka. He said, felt pretty safe in the first game. My hand matched up pretty well with his, aside from his annoying A259. It was hard to have coverage of the A259 here. One sec, I'm going to resize stuff a little just so I can read a little easier. All right, while clicking the forward button. In the next game, my second move was too complicated, and I should have tried calculating more simple lines to tie or win instead of confusing myself. Didn't think I played that game very well, and felt lucky to tie. Third game, I feel like and third game is the one here. I wish I'd written game 3 in the top, but this is from game 3. Third game, I feel like I applied a lot of pressure despite second turn. He did miss a tie on his third card, but it was in a weird spot, so I can't blame him for not finding it. I didn't see it at first until Delial pointed it out after. This is the key position. Really hard to find the saves for Tezuka. Tezuka afterwards said he was saying what other moves he spent a lot of time looking at, and the main move he considered, aside from the one he played, but the one he played was a bit of a desperation move. The main move he considered was 1, 9, 8, 7, and 8, and that actually did hold, even though it walks into a whole bunch of combo stuff and doesn't look great. But Tezuka was quite close to managing the tie here, but didn't quite get there, and it was a very, I think, difficult tie to find. So I asked 2 questions about this one. Firstly, 3 of your 4 wins were on second turn. I often make the claim that because first turn is last turn, it generally benefits first turn for there to be low numbers facing out, and second turn has more incentive to play higher numbers facing out. If you have last turn, it's really nice to have your card be able to capture everything available, right? The more low numbers there are, the easier it is for last turn to be able to take everything, for those spots that are like 50-50s to just be, no, you have all captures in every square, or just to sweep endgames, right? And if you're second turn, that conversely means you often want to have higher numbers sticking out because you don't want first turn's cards to be able to sweep those endgames. So that's sort of the theory I'm proposing here. 2 of your 3 second turn wins sort of accord with this. You began with a strong corner, but the victory over Tezuka doesn't at all, specifically with this move 7, 3, 2, 5, and 1, and you got a huge initiative off your weak corner. Do you think this principle is mistaken and dumb, and I should feel ashamed for ever saying it? More seriously, what draws you to weaker corners in general? I've always been curious about this. I find it remarkable how often you play a weak corner and immediately win or have huge pressure, and would love to hear some of the thought process behind it. After your first move, the position looked innocuous to me, yet a move later, it looked completely winning. Right? This position looks super dominant. It's so hard for Tezuka to engage with either of Seto's cards. Seto has so many cards on board he can attack. It is kind of a miracle that Tezuka has ties here, and really impressive that he almost played them. But also, if we go back a turn, to me, this does not look like a position where second turn is a move away from being all but winning, right? So Seto says, as far as being advantaged by first turn with weak corners, I suppose it depends on the hand matchup and the rule set. I find this harder to do when there is no plus wall. Back in the prime days of TTA, I almost always tried to make a hand with a middle starter, but most tournament rounds now have number combo restrictions and include a lot of cross-level rule sets where middle starters just don't work that well. I don't disagree with your principle. As a general rule, you start with a weak throwaway card so you can save your higher powered cards for the endgame. However, it's important to choose lower level cards that have some potential to plus wall your higher level cards, or at least common numbers that you could see used on your opponent's higher level cards. For example, the 3-2-3-2 and 3-4-3-4 I used in Game 2 against Midas gave plenty of plus wall options with the 9s all over the board. Since your opponent is going second, they could potentially have 2 power cards left, so making sure you can counteract that by having your own power card or at least solid plus wall potential is important. So here we definitely see Seto using his weakest card, right, as a weak corner. And it follows that, but I think there's a lot more going on here. And also, he veered into talking a bit about using it as a first turn strategy rather than a second turn strategy here. So I followed up with sort of covered talking about weak corners, but I wondered what the reasoning was on 7-3-2-5 and 1 here. And he said, partially to get it out of my hand, since I didn't foresee much of a use for it later on. And I think there's both the idea that this is the weakest card in the hand, which it is, but there's also what is the weakest card is going to change depending on cards on board, the directionality of the game, what cards happen to line up with the opponent's hand, all that stuff, right? And so you start calculating lines and looking for ideas, and you find, hey, that card just doesn't seem to have play in any of the lines I looked at. And simply the value of getting rid of that card. I sometimes talk about like when there's a square on the board that's really bad for you and good for your opponent. Sometimes, even though you have nothing particularly good to do there, getting rid of that square just so it doesn't bite you later, the earlier you can get rid of it, the less kind of dangerous that square is, and the less likely you'll be forced to go there in some moment you can't afford to block there, or you allow your opponent to go there and just get crushed. And so there's this kind of get rid of dangerous squares for you as early as possible. But similarly, there's get rid of dangerous cards for you as early as possible. And something I think Seto did really well this tournament, does really well in general, is I don't want to use this card. But for most of us, for players like me, I don't want to need to use this card in the future. For a player like me, I'm kind of thinking, what can I achieve with it? And Seto was really good at just playing it as a weak corner and yet still achieving a lot. And over the course of this game, one key point is 1987 can never take that too. This is actually a slightly harder card to take than it looks like. Also, if you look at kind of captures in 2, 5672 can't take it. 7864 and 2 is comboed by 5476. 1987 and 2 is comboed by 5476. So he finds a way to use these very weak numbers, but direct the game such that they're actually quite serious numbers to have facing out. I just think that's really interesting how he manages to do that. So he also says, also to hopefully make him go in 3, which he did, or possibly 9, which looked worse at first glance. Him going 4 didn't look very worrisome at the time, since I'd be able to set up strong positions in 2 or 8 after. And I think that's an argument for adjacent corners against a weak corner starter, that fundamentally against a weak corner starter, you have lots of ability to capture, right? And if you play an adjacent corner, the most common move is to block the in-between square. But if someone blocks the in-between square, it's now really easy to set up a lot of different Ls, right? You're going to have so many options between which Ls you want to go for. They go 5, you can go 2, you can go 8. Sometimes, Akiyama loves to go 5 in those positions. But you have so many potential ways to attack that surely at least some of them are pretty good, right? You just have so many options. And so Tezuka ends up going somewhere else, and Tezuka sort of follows my theory. He tries to play a weak corner, right? And ends up getting in a lot of trouble really quickly because Seto has this really strong play in 2. But what this sort of suggests is by meeting a weak corner with an adjacent weak corner, you cut off the natural blocking move in 4, right? You sort of remove that. And from the opponent's perspective, they're on first turn, so they do want to put out weak corners. So a move like Tezuka's makes a ton of sense in general. But to do so, one of the things about weak corners is they often unbalance your hand. I'm kind of getting in the weeds here and not really responding to what he said, but I think this is really interesting, right? When you use 4, 1, 7, 6, and 7, you are using a card that wants to go down left, right? And making the game down left. When you use 7, 8, 6, 4, and 3, you are using a card that wants to go upright while making the game more upright. When you do these weak corners, you often give up power facing the action. So Tezuka's on first turn, he's incentivized to play weak corners. However, when he does so, he has to make power concessions. And what happens here is Seto does not play, another weak corner here. Seto now starts playing challenging stuff, right? Seto now starts saying, you have to do something on board, and you really don't have the ability to do so. If you start taking, this is just such a powerful card to have land, or something like this. I forget if this is exactly right. Is this correct? Yeah, this is correct. So you can't go there. Um, if you go 5, let's just have the AI tell me that loses to this, possibly loses to multiple things. I forget. Yeah, there are multiple wins, all in 6. Yeah. So like you just, it's really hard to attack my stuff. So he is not staying with low numbers forever. He's just playing this one low numbered card that actually makes Tezuka have this really difficult decision. Because if we think about it, does this challenge Tezuka? The answer is no. But if we think about what can Tezuka do next, and this is sort of where Seto was headed, of like, I thought he had to go in 3 or 9, and those gave me really nice options. If you go in 9, there's sort of this potential safety in 8. If you go in 3, I have this strong move in 2. You can't really go in 4 without giving me infinite L options. This might just be a really good argument that the best way to meet a weak corner starter, and Smokes has talked about something really similar on this, but it's a case that the best way to meet a weak corner starter is to play an adjacent very weak corner and just ask them to find a move. Set it up so you have some play against their captures, right? Here, Seto has really nice play if Tezuka ever wants to take in 2. But and get rid of the card in your hand that has the least play in the future, right? Seto is doing a lot of things nicely here, but at a fundamental level, what he's doing with this move is not really doing something that important on board, but he's giving Tezuka a difficult choice to make. Where if Tezuka wants to play the kind of defensive way, he just concedes so many L's. And if Tezuka wants to keep playing kind of weak corners, he has to make really big concessions because he's giving up squares that Seto is now ready to play in. And in fact, Seto doesn't need power facing up left, though he has it. He kind of needs power facing away from it, right? It's the moves with power facing out from it that are going to be so effective here. And I would guess in this position that a move like this is quite good. Though we can actually just get the evaluation. So a bunch of ties here, no wins. But if we play a move, we can then see, all right, this move is terrible. Okay, not that one. Bad idea. Let's do this instead. We can see kind of dangerous for the opponent. All the red is losses. All right, let's ignore my evaluations here. They don't seem so accurate at the moment. But I think it's a really interesting concept, and I really wanted to dive into it a bit because I think it's one of the reasons Seto is such a fascinating player, is that this moves like 7-3-2-5 and 1, that he can just win tournament finals games with moves like this, and do it in style and do it really comfortably and well, strikes me as something that other players aren't really doing, and we should try to learn from his example. All right, let's move on to the next game. I'm going to start with this first game he played versus Midas, and then give his description, specifically this position. I said, Midas' save in 8 in game 1. Is Midas' save in game 1 the best single move played against you over the tournament? That was a very tough position for him. I also asked, after said move in 8, I'm curious where you looked first. Not necessarily the best moves, but what you consider first. For me, 9-9-1A and 7, 5-3-3-4 and 2, and 1-7-8-9-6 were the 3 moves that seemed like they had to be checked. Anything from that list you'd ignore at first, or other moves you'd check first. So I've been thinking a bunch about style recently, and this question was kind of, often players would make the same moves. Seto ended up playing 9-9-1A and 7, and the game ended up as a tie. And I was also, I'm pretty sure in my commentary, suggesting I'd probably end up playing 9-9-1A and 7 here because I don't think there's a win. So we ended up on the same move, but a lot of the differences between players are not necessarily that you end up on different moves, right? If there's a clear correct or best move, hopefully you both end up on it. The difference is going to be which moves you're immediately drawn to considering. And so I wanted to hear if he was drawn to different moves, because I think we are clearly very different players. And I was curious where his eyes went first, what looked like the key squares here. So he said, to be honest, when I made the move in 4, I only saw that he had a potential plus by putting 3-3-4-4 in 8. I also missed that 8-9-8-2 was the setup in my commentary, so we're on the same page. He set up with 8-9-8-2 instead, so my first thought was, shit, However, as you work through it, you can quickly see it's a tie. I first looked at 7, as it's my instinct to block the corner in that situation. This may just be an instinct I developed from all the closed games I play. Yeah, so one thing that I think closed makes pretty clear is closed you are playing against a range of hands, right? You are playing against all the possible things they could have. Open, you are playing against specifics. Closed, you are playing against possibility. So, closed, in some senses, you have to be more proper, right? You know, in an open game, it might be that there's some wild move in 3 that happens to set up perfectly against their cards, but you can't play that move in closed because you can't see their cards, right? 3 is almost never going to be correct because 3 requires such specific things to make work, and you don't have the information to justify that. In closed, you essentially have to make the normal move more often because that's going to be the best move against the range of what they could have. This is not to say there isn't creativity and ways to go off the beaten path in closed, but it's to say a lot of decisions in closed, if there's the free square, you should take it because on average that will be the best move and you should play what's on average the best move. So when Seto says he looks at 7 first because he's playing so much closed, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? In closed, you really have to be going 7 a huge percentage of the time. It should be pretty rare that you don't go in 7 in these setups. Fairly rare. Um, and in open, there are more reasons you might not want to, is how I'd put it. All right, where was I? Once I saw that 991A and 7 was a tie, I started looking at weirder moves like 5334 and 5, since he couldn't take 4 from 7, then both 5334 and 1789 and 2 to hopefully take advantage of his lack of upward power. And so here again we can see a little bit of difference in where we were looking. We both checked 5334 and 2, and we both checked 991A and 7. But my other instinct was 1789 and 6, grab a card where we can. And for him, that was not a card he considered, at least in his first check, taking out of his hand. That's too important a card. It has a threat in 6, it has a same in 5, right? That kind of has this sweeper, a big capture potential. And I am looking more to what can I do on the board now, and he is looking more to which cards can I keep for later, and how can I make the directions tough for my opponent. All right. So his summary of the match is against Midas. Not much to say about the first game. It was pretty straightforward. He's as good as anyone on the site, so I couldn't take any risks early on. Glad to get first turn in the second game. Felt like it was heavily advantaged in the cross-level format. His move in 5 surprised me. Let's go to his move in 5. Oh no, I just lost my place. Oh, there we are. So let's go to the next game. So Seto started in 2, and Midas went in 5. His move in 5 surprised me. I thought he was for sure going 3 or maybe 6. Both Deli and I were saying 3, 3, 4, 4, and 3 was our predicted move. I didn't ask. I wish I had asked if that was the move Seto was expecting in 3 as well. I think it's probably a safe guess to assume it was. The Titan Larsa combo was a powerhouse. It was vital to get both of my low levels out early so I could take advantage of late game power. Glad to have found the move in 8 that ultimately sealed it. Yeah, well, the solver will tell you technically this is not a winning position. In practice, this would beat anyone on the planet. Larsa and Titan are just such powerful sweepers in this position. And in a nice example of where I think Seto is so strong, he very quickly played 2, 9, 9, 3, and 9 here, just leaving himself with these wonderful sweepers for the remaining game, and a really good feel for just getting rid of the card that's not useful. And it just doesn't matter that much if it has high numbers facing out. Like I think I have really useful instincts for what's a card I don't want and how can I find use for it. But Seto is even better at finding use for it because I often need it to be doing kind of something, right? It needs to have some number that's tricky facing out or something it locks in. And here Seto is, he's using it to get the structure he wants, right? He wants this Z structure where Larsa sweeps the left and Titan sweeps the right. But he is not really doing anything else with the card besides setting the structure. And I think he's just really, really good at finding moves like that, at finding just which is the card I don't want, where can I put it that orients the game how I want it oriented. And I think that's probably a nice through thread of all the great moves he makes. I asked, feels like it's a Brotherhood of Seed thing to meet side starters in 5, Yojimbo's so called plug. 8 was super strong. I liked how you organized the game so your cards swept their counterparts in Midas's hand in the endgame. He says, as far as meeting side starters in 5, I do recall Yoji liked to do that. For me personally, it goes against my instinct. I usually look for an opposite corner first. If they start in 2, I look at 7 or 9. If they start 6, I look at 1 or 7, etc. I rarely do side starters myself, but the corner starters in Game 2 didn't appeal to me. And my last question was, I haven't thought about best match of the tourney yet. Do you have a pick? And he said, can't speak to this too much. I only caught a handful of other people's games throughout the tourney. My first thought is Game 2 of me against Turdz. Our hands comboed each other easily, so I thought each move had to be calculated very precisely. I also liked how well Midas played in his winning game against Ellie. That was a good watch, as were the 2 games before it. So just to give that game, I don't think I recorded during this game. I don't think I caught it. Um, so just the game, in case you want to give it a look for yourself, that Seto identified as the best played game of his in the tourney. And yeah, thanks so much for doing these answers. I agreed to say stuff about Canada for doing this, so I'll say Canada is cool. I don't think that's what I agreed to say, and obviously I am at gunpoint when saying it, but something like that was what I agreed to say in exchange for him doing this interview. And it's really neat to get the thoughts of someone as they win a major tournament, um, what they were thinking at different points, and how they felt about the games. And as I've said many times in my videos, I think Seto is just a very interesting player stylistically, and one I can learn a lot from. So, yeah, I think that's it for this video. Cheers.